In the mist-shrouded hills of Appalachia in the early months of 1913, a quiet village seemed untouched by time. Wooden homes, worn and weathered by decades of rain and frost, clung stubbornly to the slopes, while narrow dirt paths twisted between patches of forest and farmland. Smoke curled from chimneys in a thin spiral, and the distant crow of roosters punctuated the otherwise solemn silence. Life here was hard, measured by the slow rhythm of the seasons, the strength of one's hands, and the health of one's livestock. People were familiar with hardship and death, yet even in a land acquainted with suffering, a story began to circulate that made hearts tighten and voices lower in hushed tones, a story of children whose faces were not merely similar, but identical. It began quietly, with whispers in the local general store, where women exchanged gossip while their children played near the wooden counter. At first, it was little more than curiosity. A family had given birth to a child whose features were strikingly familiar to everyone who knew the community. A nose shaped like another child's, the same deep-set eyes, the same high cheekbones and solemn expression that seemed older than their years. People remarked on the uncanny resemblance, but then, as months passed, a second child arrived bearing the same set of features. And a third. By the end of the year, there were several children in the village whose faces mirrored one another with an almost impossible precision. Those who saw them together could not shake the feeling that they were looking at reflections rather than separate individuals. The air in the village thickened with unease. Some spoke of curses, while others speculated about divine intervention. Stories spread like wildfire. Mothers whispered in the dark that the family had angered the spirits of the mountains, that the same hand which shaped the first child's face had been applied to all the others in some unnatural act. It was not mere resemblance that unsettled the villagers. It was the feeling that the very fabric of nature had been bent in some inexplicable way. Children, usually a source of joy and hope, had become a reflection of something eerie and unsettling. The villagers, practical and often dismissive of superstition in daily life, now found themselves caught between disbelief and fear. Word of the phenomenon reached the nearby towns, and eventually, a local newspaper printed a tentative article describing the children who share the same face. The report was brief and clinical, yet it carried an undertone of fascination and dread. Readers were introduced to the concept of genetic inheritance, though the scientific understanding of the time was rudimentary at best. Doctors knew that traits could be passed from parent to child, yet they could not explain how so many children within a single family, or even several families in the same region, could exhibit such striking similarity. Some suggested coincidence, while others proposed that environmental factors in the isolated mountains might somehow influence development. But for the villagers themselves, these explanations felt hollow. What they saw with their own eyes seemed beyond the reach of reason or science. The parents of the children became reluctant local celebrities, though they had sought no attention. Visitors arrived at their modest home, ostensibly to offer help or examine the children, but more often out of sheer curiosity. Farmers, teachers, and travelers would linger at the fence, staring, whispering, and sometimes retreating in fear. The family faced a complex mixture of pity, suspicion, and fascination. Neighbors who once visited freely now hesitated, uncertain if the children's appearances were an omen, or if it was polite to ignore the obvious. The adults struggled to protect their children from gossip and the relentless stare of outsiders, yet the very nature of the anomaly made concealment impossible. Doctors began arriving from outside the immediate area, bringing with them measuring tools, notebooks, and an air of authority. They observed, measured, and photographed the children, attempting to catalogue their features systematically. Despite meticulous notes, the physicians found themselves baffled. Faces that should have shown variation seemed impossibly uniform, as if carved from the same mold. Some speculated about rare congenital conditions, while others were more cautious, noting that the sample size was small and the phenomenon could be explained by familial resemblance magnified by limited genetic diversity in the region. The children themselves, unaware of the stir surrounding them, lived their small, repetitive days, playing in the yard, helping with chores, attending the sparse one-room schoolhouse, but the presence of visitors, the clicks of cameras, and the endless scrutiny weighed heavily on their young shoulders. The villagers, deeply rooted in superstition, were convinced that ordinary explanations could not suffice. Tales spread of the family being touched by the spirits of the mountains or cursed by long-forgotten ancestors. Some whispered that the children had been conceived under unusual circumstances, under certain moons or at crossroads where the Earth's energies were strongest. The lines between folklore and reality blurred, and the mystery grew larger in proportion to the fear it inspired. Children in the village who had once been familiar and comforting became subjects of comparison, and some parents began to scrutinize the faces of their own offspring, searching for signs of the uncanny repetition. Yet amid fear and speculation, a strange beauty lingered in the story. Observers noted the symmetry, the elegance, the almost surreal perfection of the children's features. Some could not look away, drawn into the hypnotic uniformity of eyes, noses, and mouths that seemed to echo across multiple faces. It was a beauty that carried its own darkness, a reminder that nature, while capable of producing stunning forms, can also produce something deeply unsettling when it strays beyond the expected. By the end of 1913, the story of the children with the same face had transcended the boundaries of the village and reached a wider audience. It was recounted in whispers in neighboring counties, described in scientific journals with cautious fascination, and remembered in folklore that would survive for decades. The anomaly became a lens through which the community, and later historians, would examine the delicate interplay of heredity, superstition, isolation, and human curiosity. No one could explain the phenomenon definitively. Scientists and villagers alike were left to grapple with the same chilling question. How could so many children share a single, unmistakable visage? Was it the invisible hand of genetics, a cruel twist of nature, or something that defied rational explanation entirely? The village remained, in those years, a place of mystery and unease, where fog hung heavy over the hills, shadows played across wooden doorways, and the children moved through the community like living reflections of one another, their identical faces haunting the memories of all who saw them. The story would endure, not merely as a historical oddity, but as a tale of human fascination, fear, and the relentless search for answers in the face of the inexplicable. Life in Appalachia during the early 20th century was a harsh, unyielding affair, defined by isolation, endurance, and a deeply ingrained connection to the land. The mountains themselves seemed to dictate the rhythm of life. Steep ridges and dense forests separated one community from another, making travel difficult and communication slow. Roads were little more than dirt tracks, often impassable after rain, and the nearest town with a doctor, a newspaper, or a post office could be a day's journey away on foot or horseback. In such seclusion, families relied heavily on themselves and their neighbors, forging bonds that were as strong as they were insular. Outsiders were rare, and when they arrived, they were often viewed with suspicion or their strange manners and unfamiliar speech immediately marking them as different. In this environment, traditional knowledge and folklore held a powerful sway. Generations had passed down stories of spirits in the woods, of curses laid by vengeful ancestors, and of inexplicable occurrences that defied the understanding of science. People were pragmatic. They hunted, farmed, and mended their homes, but their pragmatism coexisted with a worldview steeped in the supernatural. When a child fell ill or an unusual birth occurred, the community often interpreted it through a dual lens, a recognition of physical reality and a search for meaning in the unseen. Diseases were attributed to poor weather or tainted water, but sometimes also to the intervention of spirits or punishment for moral failings. In Appalachia, life and superstition were intertwined in ways that outsiders often struggled to understand. The village itself was a microcosm of this rugged way of life. Wooden cabins with tin roofs were scattered along winding paths, their foundations hewn from the surrounding stone. Gardens and small plots of farmland were meticulously tended, providing sustenance in a land that offered little in abundance. Chickens pecked in the yards, pigs rooted in the mud, and cows were milked by hand each morning. Children worked alongside their parents from an early age, learning to tend animals, gather firewood, and assist in planting and harvesting. Schooling, when it existed, was rudimentary. Children were often expected to prioritize labor over literacy. Medical care was limited, rudimentary, and often feared. Local midwives were the primary attendants for childbirth, relying on centuries-old knowledge passed down through oral tradition. Their methods, though sometimes effective, lacked the scientific rigor that outsiders might recognize, and complications during birth could easily become fatal. Doctors were few, and when they were called upon, they often traveled long distances to reach patients. Hospitals were rare, and even where they existed, treatment was primitive compared to modern standards. In such conditions, the birth of multiple children with unusual or identical facial features could ignite both curiosity and fear. Without clear medical explanations, villagers often turned to folklore, superstition, and moral reasoning to understand the phenomenon. Poverty was another defining element of Appalachian life. Families lived frugally, with little surplus beyond what could sustain them through the harsh winters. Food was simple: cornmeal, beans, salted pork, and whatever vegetables could be grown in small plots. Hunting supplemented the diet, but the hunt itself was dangerous and dependent on skill and luck. Clothing was homemade or passed down through generations, often patched repeatedly. Children, while cherished, were also expected to contribute to the survival of the family from a young age, fetching water, tending livestock, and assisting in household chores. Education and entertainment were limited, and stories, songs, and local law provided both diversion and instruction. It was against this backdrop of isolation, superstition, and scarcity that the story of the children with identical faces unfolded. In a region where family lineage and reputation carried immense weight, the sudden appearance of children who seemed to defy natural variation was more than a curiosity, it was a disruption of the social fabric. Families took pride in the uniqueness of their children, the small differences that marked one household from another. Suddenly, in one small community, multiple children appeared to be almost indistinguishable, not just in their physical features but in the subtle ways they carried themselves. The effect was uncanny, almost surreal. Neighbors could not help but notice, comparing one child to the next, and whispers of something unnatural began to circulate. The isolation of the region amplified the mystery. There were no nearby specialists to consult, no rapid means of communication to verify or refute the phenomenon, and no modern understanding of genetics to provide answers. Instead, speculation filled the gaps. Some villagers suggested that the children were the product of a long-standing family curse, a punishment for sins committed generations ago. Others offered explanations rooted in the supernatural, claiming that the same spirit had chosen to visit the family repeatedly, leaving a mark upon each child's face. The lack of empirical evidence allowed such theories to flourish, each story more elaborate than the last, each retelling more ominous. Daily life in the village carried on amid this strange undercurrent of fascination and fear. Children played in the fields, oblivious to the whispers surrounding them, while their parents tried to shield them from scrutiny. But concealment was nearly impossible. Visitors arrived with cameras, notebooks, and measuring instruments, seeking to document what they perceived as a remarkable anomaly. The presence of outsiders disrupted the rhythm of village life, bringing both excitement and tension. Some residents welcomed the attention, hoping for answers or even financial aid. Others bristled at the intrusion, fearing that their private struggles would become public spectacle. The landscape itself seemed to heighten the drama. Mist clung to the valleys each morning, and the mountains cast long shadows over the scattered homes, giving the entire region a sense of seclusion and timelessness. Forests whispered in the wind, and animals moved silently through the underbrush, adding to the sense that the village existed in a world separate from the one beyond the mountains. In such a place, any anomaly, however explainable, took on an aura of inevitability, as if the land itself had conspired to produce these uncanny children. Even the social structure of the village contributed to the intensity of attention. Communities were tight-knit, and every birth, marriage, or death was noticed and recorded in memory if not on paper. Extended families lived near one another, and the arrival of unusual children was impossible to overlook. Gossip spread quickly, but with a careful adherence to social etiquette. No one spoke outright of curses or divine punishment in public, but in private homes, behind closed doors, theories flourished. Mothers and grandmothers exchanged hushed comments about the uncanny resemblance, fathers offered grim nods of acknowledgement, and older children learned to observe without speaking. This combination of isolation, superstition, and poverty created a fertile ground for the story of the identical-faced children to take root. The village, already accustomed to hardship and the unpredictable forces of nature, found itself confronting something that defied both expectation and understanding. The children became both a source of fascination and a mirror reflecting the community's deepest fears, that nature might not always be kind, that heredity might harbor secrets beyond comprehension, and that even in the familiarity of their home, the world could still surprise them with the unexplainable. The family at the center of the mystery was ordinary in nearly every respect, yet from the moment the first child was born, they became extraordinary in the eyes of their community. The parents, a man and woman who had lived their entire lives within the mountain valleys, were hard-working, quiet people, known for their diligence and adherence to the rhythms of the land. They were farmers in the truer sense, tending fields that barely yielded enough to feed their household, raising a few chickens and pigs, and relying on the forest for supplemental food. Life had been a steady, predictable cycle of labor and survival, the kind of existence that seemed to leave little room for wonder or for horror. Yet when their first child arrived, the air of predictability fractured in a way that neither science nor superstition could explain. The child's features were striking from birth. The villagers who saw the baby in those first weeks could not reconcile what they were witnessing with the ordinary variations of human appearance. The eyes were a deep, dark shade, framed by heavy lids that gave the child a somber expression beyond their months. The nose, small and precise, seemed almost identical to that of a distant cousin, though no one had expected such resemblance. The mouth, the cheeks, and even the set of the jaw carried a symmetry that bordered on the unnatural. As neighbors whispered in the dim light of passing evenings, speculation grew. Was this merely coincidence, or something more deliberate, more sinister? As the years passed and more children were born, the pattern became undeniable. Each child bore the same facial blueprint as the first, as if the genetic dice had been loaded in a singular, impossible way. The similarities were not subtle, they were striking, the kind that caused visitors to pause mid-step, forcing them to look twice, then again, as if seeing one child could somehow confirm the existence of another. The parents, proud yet burdened, struggled with the duality of their situation. They had brought these children into the world with love, yet the world outside their home could not view them with anything other than fascination and, in some cases, fear. The community's reactions were varied, from awe to trepidation. Some neighbors approached the family with genuine curiosity, asking questions in careful tones, trying not to offend. Others recoiled, whispering in corners, muttering about curses or divine intervention. A few of the more imaginative villagers concocted theories that bordered on the supernatural. Perhaps the children had been touched by a spirit in the forest, or maybe the family's ancestors had made a pact long forgotten. It was impossible to separate fact from folklore in a place where imagination often filled the gaps left by science. The family's home became a stage for quiet observation. Visitors, both sympathetic and prying, would come to see the children, their expressions a mixture of admiration and unease. Some brought notebooks and measuring tools, hoping to record the phenomenon with the precision that science demanded. Others came with cameras, attempting to capture the likenesses in photographs that would later be studied and circulated beyond the mountains. The parents, protective yet aware of the world beyond their valley, allowed these intrusions reluctantly, torn between pride in their children and fear of what attention might bring. The children themselves, blissfully unaware of the stir they caused, continued to play in the yard, chase chickens, or gather firewood, their identical faces often confusing outsiders who were unaccustomed to such uniformity. Within the household, the children's likeness created subtle tensions. Siblings struggled with the weight of being so closely compared, their individuality often overshadowed by the striking similarities that defined their appearances. The parents, conscious of this, made efforts to nurture distinct personalities, encouraging hobbies and activities that allowed each child to express themselves in ways unrelated to their faces. Still, no amount of play or education could entirely mask the uncanny resemblance. Even in moments of joy, the mirror-like reflections of one another's features remained a constant presence, a reminder of the anomaly that had reshaped the family's existence. The psychological impact on the parents was profound. They experienced a mix of pride, protectiveness, and deep concern. They understood the fascination their children inspired, yet they were acutely aware of the social consequences. Gossip in a small, tightly knit community could be relentless, and there were fears that the children might be ostracized or treated as curiosities rather than individuals. The parents worried about education, marriage prospects, and the children's ability to navigate a world that might not see beyond the surface. In quiet moments, they reflected on the uncanny nature of the births, wondering if it was a blessing, a curse, or simply an inexplicable twist of nature beyond human comprehension. Despite the attention, life in the home retained a rhythm grounded in necessity. Days began before dawn with chores, feeding livestock, tending gardens, and preparing meals. Evenings were quiet, with the family gathering by the fire, telling stories, or repairing clothes and tools. The children, although remarkable in appearance, were remarkably ordinary in their behaviors, curious, playful, sometimes mischievous. Their laughter, cries, and tantrums mirrored that of any other child, a stark contrast to the fascination their faces provoked outside the home. This juxtaposition, the ordinary and the extraordinary coexisting within a single household, was a source of both comfort and tension for the parents. Neighbors who interacted with the family often noted this duality. The children, though identical in appearance, displayed distinct temperaments. One might be quiet and contemplative, another boisterous and energetic, a third thoughtful and sensitive. These differences, though subtle, humanized the children and challenged the narrative that they were mere curiosities. Yet to the casual observer, the similarities in their features were impossible to ignore. and the tension between what was seen and what was known created an aura of unease. As time passed, the family became increasingly aware that their lives had been irrevocably altered by the children's appearances. Daily routines were punctuated by questions from neighbors, visitors, and occasional journalists. The parents learned to navigate these interactions with a careful balance of openness and discretion, revealing enough to satisfy curiosity while protecting their children from exploitation or ridicule. They kept detailed records, noting the growth and development of each child, observations about personality, health, and the subtle ways each child diverged from the others. These records, intended as personal documentation, would later prove invaluable to historians and medical researchers attempting to understand the phenomenon. Yet, amid the scrutiny and the careful management of appearances, moments of profound tenderness persisted. The family shared quiet nights by the fire, celebrating birthdays, teaching lessons about the land, and imparting values that transcended physical appearance. In these moments, the anomaly faded into the background, leaving only the bond of parent and child, sibling and sibling. The extraordinary faces that had drawn so much attention became secondary to the ordinary human connections that defined daily life, connections that were invisible to outsiders but formed the true essence of the family story. As the children grew, the uncanny resemblance continued to fascinate visitors and locals alike. Their identical features, once a cause for whispers, became a defining characteristic of the family in the eyes of the broader community. Yet the parents remained vigilant, aware that fascination could easily turn to exploitation. They worried about the long-term impact on their children's lives, understanding that in a society still steeped in superstition and prejudice, appearances could shape destinies in ways beyond their control. The balance between ordinary life and extraordinary attention became the central challenge of their existence, a delicate act that demanded both courage and resilience. Through it all, the family endured, navigating a world that was both captivated and unsettled by their children. The mystery of the identical faces remained unsolved, a haunting presence in the lives of all who encountered them. Yet within the home, life continued with a quiet determination, ordinary and extraordinary interwoven in a way that mirrored the mountains themselves, rugged, beautiful, and unyielding. It was in this delicate tension between fascination and protection, between fear and love, that the true story of the family unfolded, a story that would echo through history as a testament to the complexity, resilience, and enduring mystery of human life. The arrival of medical attention marked a turning point in the lives of the family and the surrounding community, bringing with it both hope and a new layer of tension. In 1913, the mountains of Appalachia were largely isolated from the centers of scientific study, and physicians were scarce. Yet word of the children with identical faces had traveled beyond the narrow valleys, reaching the ears of traveling doctors, anthropologists, and local physicians curious about anomalies that defied conventional explanation. The first visitors arrived cautiously, often on horseback or in rattling wagons, their equipment strapped tightly, notebooks in hand, and eyes trained to observe every minute detail. Their presence was both fascinating and unnerving, for the villagers were unused to the intrusion of formal medical scrutiny, and the parents were suddenly responsible for presenting their children to the wider world. Doctors approached their task with a mixture of scientific rigor and bewilderment. They measured skulls, noting the width of cheekbones, the angles of jaws, and the spacing of eyes. They catalogued hair color, skin tone, and subtle asymmetries that, in their professional opinion, might explain the striking similarities. Yet no matter how carefully they recorded the data, the conclusions remained elusive. Faces that should have shown variation seemed almost impossibly uniform, as if each child had been modeled from the same template. Some doctors suggested that perhaps environmental factors were at play, the harsh mountain air, the diet limited to what the land could provide, but these explanations felt insufficient. The physical uniformity appeared too precise, too consistent, to be reduced to circumstance alone. Local villagers, observing the process, were both intrigued and frightened. The arrival of outsiders validated the rumors, confirming that the children were indeed remarkable, yet it also heightened anxiety. Parents whispered that the doctors were probing too deeply, that they might uncover secrets better left hidden. Children who had once been able to wander the yard freely now found themselves subjected to careful observation, their movements catalogued, their expressions noted, and their daily behaviors scrutinized. Even the act of play became a spectacle, transformed by the weight of attention into a kind of study, as though innocence itself could be measured. The scientists themselves were not immune to the unease that hung over the community. Though trained in observation and accustomed to human variation, they found themselves confronting a phenomenon that challenged their understanding. Photographs were taken, though the technology of the time produced grainy, monochromatic images that captured only a fraction of the uncanny uniformity. Notes were meticulously written, with diagrams attempting to outline facial ratios and similarities, but even the most precise measurements could not convey the almost supernatural resemblance. Some visiting doctors began to speculate aloud, their voices tinged with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief, about whether this was an extraordinary genetic occurrence or an anomaly that defied the laws of heredity altogether. Medical theories of the era were limited. Genetics was a young science. Mendel's discoveries were slowly gaining recognition, but the application to human development was still rudimentary. Doctors relied heavily on observation, classification, and comparison to other known conditions. They drew upon anthropological studies, examining records of hereditary traits and congenital anomalies, yet none seemed to match what they observed in this remote Appalachian family. Some proposed rare syndromes or the possibility of inbreeding in isolated communities, but these explanations were conjectural at best, unable to account for the sheer precision of the facial replication. Each theory invited new questions, and with every answer, new mysteries emerged. As the investigation continued, the children became accustomed to the routines imposed upon them. Visits from doctors were structured, predictable, and yet strange. They were measured in ways ordinary children were not, their faces traced, photographed, and compared. Some children accepted the process with the innocence and compliance of youth, while others resisted, sensing the intrusion into their private world. The parents worked tirelessly to reassure their children, explaining that the visitors were there to understand, not to harm, yet they themselves could not escape a lingering anxiety. How would the children be perceived beyond the mountains, in a world that had already begun to label them as curiosities? The family's isolation magnified the impact of these investigations. In cities or towns with hospitals and a broader population, anomalies could be observed in the context of a larger spectrum of human variation. Here, in the narrow Appalachian Valley, the contrast was stark. Each child's features were magnified by proximity, their identical faces impossible to contextualize against anything ordinary. The result was an intense focus from both medical professionals and locals alike, a spotlight that brought admiration and fear, fascination, and unease in equal measure. The valley itself seemed to grow quieter during these visits, the daily rhythm of work and chores punctuated by the arrival of outsiders who disrupted the ordinary flow of life. There were ethical tensions as well. While doctors were intent on studying the phenomenon, they were also confronted by the humanity of their subjects. The children were not specimens. They were living beings with emotions, personalities, and vulnerabilities. Some scientists, particularly those with a more humanistic approach, recognized this and treated the children with tenderness and care. Others were less sensitive, focused solely on data collection, inadvertently creating moments of distress for the family. These dynamics added another layer of complexity to an already fraught situation, highlighting the precarious balance between scientific inquiry and moral responsibility. Over time, the medical interest expanded beyond the immediate community. Reports were sent to colleagues, letters exchanged between physicians in distant towns, and occasionally, brief mentions appeared in newspapers. The children became emblematic of the unknown, a tangible reminder that nature could produce outcomes that even the trained eye could scarcely explain. Yet despite the attention, no definitive answers emerged. Each measurement, photograph, and observation provided more data, but the fundamental mystery remained intact. The uniformity of the children's faces resisted categorization, leaving scientists and villagers alike to grapple with the limits of understanding in a world that was both tangible and enigmatic. The tension between local belief and scientific curiosity grew more pronounced with each visit. Villagers, accustomed to interpreting unusual events through folklore, were sometimes skeptical of the doctor's explanations. They listened politely, but in their hearts, they still clung to ancestral tales of spirits, curses, and divine intervention. For the parents, this duality was exhausting. They navigated the overlapping worlds of superstition and science, seeking to protect their children while engaging with those who sought answers. The result was a delicate dance of disclosure, concealment, and negotiation, as they attempted to satisfy curiosity without exposing their children to unnecessary harm or ridicule. Through it all, the children continued to grow, their faces maintaining the uncanny resemblance that had first drawn attention. The medical investigations documented their development, noting subtle changes in expression, posture, and growth, yet the overall uniformity remained astonishing. The parents watched with a mixture of pride and apprehension, aware that the outside world would forever view their family through the lens of this anomaly. They understood that no explanation, no matter how scientifically rigorous, could fully protect their children from the fascination and fear that their appearance inspired. The medical examination of the children in 1913 Appalachia became more than a study of heredity or congenital anomalies. It was an intersection of science and human experience, a collision between the rational pursuit of knowledge and the deeply emotional responses that arise when the natural order appears disrupted. The children were living evidence of an extraordinary mystery, their identical features challenging assumptions about individuality, inheritance, and the boundaries of human understanding. In the fog-laden valleys, under the careful gaze of physicians and the watchful eyes of neighbors, the family existed in a liminal space between ordinary life and the unknown, their lives forever altered by the impossible reflection of faces that seemed to mirror one another in a haunting, inescapable pattern. By the time the phenomenon of the children with identical faces had drawn the attention of scientists, physicians, and curious outsiders, speculation had begun to outpace observation. In the isolated valleys of Appalachia, the families involved had already endured months of scrutiny, and yet no clear explanation had emerged. Early 20th century medicine was still in its infancy in terms of genetics, and while Mendel's work on inheritance had slowly begun to gain recognition, most doctors remained constrained by rudimentary theories. The concept that traits could be inherited in predictable patterns existed, but the mechanics of how such precise duplication could occur across multiple children in a single family were almost entirely unknown. This gap in understanding created fertile ground for debate, conjecture, and, inevitably, fascination. Some of the earliest scientific observers turned their attention to the family lineage, combing through generations of births, marriages, and deaths in an attempt to uncover a hereditary explanation. They examined birth records, local oral histories, and anecdotal accounts, looking for patterns that might explain the remarkable resemblance. The parents themselves were questioned about their family trees, each response analyzed for possible clues. In a community so isolated that intermarriage among distant relatives was not uncommon, some physicians wondered whether inbreeding could be a factor, though the precise replication of facial features seemed too exact to be explained by common genetic proximity alone. Even these careful assessments left more questions than answers. Anthropologists and early geneticists brought a different lens to the investigation, applying what they called morphological analysis. They measured angles of the jaw, the curvature of the nose, and the spacing of the eyes, comparing these features against known averages in the population. They sought to categorize the faces according to documented congenital syndromes, but nothing matched. The children's features were not merely unusual, they were almost impossibly uniform, as if a sculptor had pressed the same mold repeatedly. For every anomaly documented in the medical texts, there was always some variation. For these children, variation seemed to vanish entirely. The implications were profound, yet also deeply unsettling. Human biology had produced an outcome that resisted existing scientific frameworks. Some physicians proposed that this phenomenon could be the result of a rare congenital condition, one that modern scientists might describe in terms of craniofacial duplication or a unique form of familial resemblance amplified by unknown genetic factors. Others were more cautious, noting that the sample size, the small number of children in this single family, was insufficient to draw broader conclusions. Still, the observation suggested that there was more at work than coincidence, that heredity in this context might operate in ways that were invisible to even the most diligent observer. These theories, while rooted in careful observation, could not fully explain the almost eerie uniformity of the children's features. At the same time, the limits of contemporary science allowed alternative explanations to flourish. Some doctors and curious visitors entertained the possibility of environmental influence. Perhaps the mountainous terrain, the diet, or even the altitude could somehow produce physical similarities in developing children. These hypotheses, though imaginative, lacked empirical support, and in many cases they reflected the broader tension between superstition and early scientific reasoning. While the observers sought rational explanations, the villagers were often more willing to embrace narratives that blended the extraordinary with the spiritual. The result was a complex interplay between observation, theory, and imagination, each perspective influencing how the phenomenon was perceived and discussed. Genetic theories, though nascent, offered the most compelling explanations, even if incomplete. Observers noted that many hereditary traits, eye color, hair texture, certain facial characteristics, followed predictable patterns. But the near-perfect replication of entire facial structures exceeded anything documented in the medical literature. Some speculated that a combination of dominant and recessive genes might be involved, interacting in an unusually precise manner. Others considered the possibility of what modern scientists would recognize as polygenic inheritance, where multiple genes contribute to a single trait, creating the appearance of a family signature. Yet even these emerging concepts could not account for the uncanny synchronicity observed among the children. The debate extended beyond the immediate scientific community. Letters were exchanged between physicians in nearby towns and those in cities further afield, each adding their own perspective or anecdotal comparison. Some scholars referred to rare cases in which siblings shared striking similarities, though never to the degree seen in this Appalachian family. Others drew on historical accounts from other regions and cultures, citing tales of children born with identical features and the social, cultural, and sometimes supernatural interpretations that accompanied them. These correspondences, preserved in notebooks and archives, reveal the tension between curiosity and disbelief, the way that empirical observation struggled to assert itself in a landscape dominated by mystery. Amid this scientific discourse, the children themselves remained the silent center of the investigation. Each new theory or hypothesis affected their daily lives, shaping how they were treated both within the home and outside it. Observers meticulously recorded their appearances, sometimes measuring expressions, gestures, and mannerisms in an effort to identify subtle differences. The effort to quantify their likeness seemed, in some cases, almost obsessive, as if human scrutiny could somehow force the mystery into a neat framework of understanding. Yet the children resisted simplification. Their individuality persisted in behavior and personality, even as their facial features remained a near-perfect reflection of one another. Modern perspectives allow us to revisit these early observations with greater clarity. Today, we understand that certain rare genetic mutations can produce strikingly similar physical traits across multiple siblings. Syndromes involving craniofacial development, combinations of dominant and recessive alleles, and isolated gene pools in geographically restricted populations can create outcomes that, to an untrained eye, appear almost unnatural. Yet even with modern genetic knowledge, the phenomenon in this Appalachian family remains remarkable, both in its precision and in the cultural context in which it occurred. The intersection of isolation, heredity, and human curiosity created a scenario that continues to fascinate historians, geneticists, and those drawn to the strange and unexplained. The mystery also underscores the limits of human understanding in the early 20th century. Physicians could measure, record, and theorize, but they were ultimately confronted with a reality that exceeded their instruments, textbooks, and frameworks. The children's faces were a living challenge to the boundaries of scientific explanation, a reminder that nature sometimes operates in ways that defy categorization. For the villagers, the phenomenon was both beautiful and unsettling, a symbol of the unknown lurking in their everyday lives. For the scientists, it was an intellectual puzzle, one that blended biology, heredity, and the ineffable quality of human variation. Ultimately, the story of the identical-faced children is a tale of convergence, of early scientific curiosity and the limits of contemporary knowledge, of isolation and heredity, of mystery and observation. The children became more than subjects of study. They were a bridge between folklore and science, between the ordinary rhythms of rural life and the extraordinary outcomes of nature. Their faces were a canvas upon which both superstition and emerging science projected meaning, each interpretation revealing as much about the observers as about the children themselves. In this light, the mystery is not merely one of biology, but of human perception, imagination, and the relentless pursuit of understanding in the face of the inexplicable. Life for the children in the remote Appalachian Valley was, in many ways, ordinary. They woke each morning to the muted light that filtered through the small windows of their wooden home, the air carrying the damp, earthy scent of the surrounding forest. Birds called from the trees, chickens clucked in the yard, and the distant mountains formed a green and grey horizon that seemed eternal. Yet their ordinary mornings were shadowed by the extraordinary circumstances of their existence. From the earliest days, the children were aware, at some level, that their faces provoked fascination, fear, and curiosity, though they could not fully comprehend the intensity with which the outside world observed them. Play, which should have been carefree, became layered with observation. Even when the children chased one another through fields or climbed the rugged slopes near their home, there were eyes watching, neighbors who paused mid-step to compare, measure, and comment on the uncanny uniformity of their features. Outsiders arrived with cameras, notebooks, and measuring tools, asking questions in tones both polite and probing. For the children, these interruptions were confusing. They were told to cooperate, to sit still, to allow strangers to examine them, yet they felt the tension, the weight of adult attention pressing down in a way that ordinary children rarely experienced. School offered little respite. In a one-room schoolhouse, with children of varying ages and abilities gathered together, the identical features of the Appalachian children stood out starkly. Classmates would stare, sometimes with innocent curiosity, sometimes with a cruel amusement that young children can summon without understanding its impact. Teachers, aware of the phenomenon, struggled to balance fairness with the persistent attention these students demanded. The children often found themselves the subjects of whispered conversations, comparisons, and sometimes teasing. Even in moments meant to foster learning and growth, the specter of their unusual likenesses hung over them, shaping interactions in ways that were subtle yet pervasive. At home, the parents worked tirelessly to shield their children from the harshest aspects of scrutiny, but protection could never be complete. The valley itself was a kind of natural enclosure. Anyone coming into the area became immediately aware of the family and the story that surrounded them. Visits from neighbors, curious travelers, and medical observers were frequent, and the children, though loved and nurtured, had little opportunity to retreat into anonymity. The parents' focus was on fostering individuality, encouraging hobbies and interests that allowed each child to express themselves beyond their identical features. They were taught music, chores, basic crafts, and the skills necessary to survive in the rugged landscape of Appalachia, yet every action was sometimes overshadowed by the gaze of the outsider. The social consequences of their appearances extended beyond mere curiosity. For the family, interactions with other villagers could be fraught with tension. Some neighbors were fascinated, observing the children with admiration or awe, but others harbored fear, suspicion, or resentment. Rumors and whispered theories spread quickly in such an insular community. Some speculated about curses, others about divine intervention. The children, though too young to fully grasp the implications, were nevertheless shaped by the reactions around them. They learned to navigate a world in which they were simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary, beloved and feared. Despite these pressures, moments of ordinary childhood persisted, though always tinged with the shadow of the uncanny. They ran barefoot through the fields in summer, climbed trees, and splashed in cold streams. They laughed, argued, and played the games of their age, yet even in these moments, their identical features set them apart. Friends and cousins observed them closely, comparing one child to the next, and in some instances, strangers who passed through the valley could not resist the urge to examine their faces, often commenting on their likeness in ways that were both innocuous and unsettling. Medical visits and external observation became an ingrained part of their existence. Regular check-ins with doctors, anthropologists, or curious outsiders meant the children were often measured, photographed, and documented in ways unfamiliar to their peers. These routines could be exhausting and sometimes frightening. A child who hesitated or resisted was gently coaxed, taught that cooperation was expected, yet the experience inevitably shaped their perception of self. They became aware, at an early age, that their faces carried meaning far beyond their control, that they were symbols of mystery, fascination, and sometimes fear. Psychologically, this constant observation had profound effects. Some children developed acute self-awareness, learning to read the expressions of adults and visitors, anticipating reactions to their presence. Others retreated inward, seeking comfort in solitude, in play that was hidden from the gaze of outsiders, or in the company of siblings with whom they shared not only likeness but understanding. The family home became both sanctuary and stage, a place where ordinary childhood could exist, yet never entirely escape the scrutiny that had become inextricably linked to their lives. The emotional weight was compounded by the broader cultural context. In Appalachia, physical appearance carried significance, and unusual traits could evoke superstition or social isolation. The children were fortunate to have parents deeply invested in their welfare, but even so, the pressures of a community attuned to the uncanny could be oppressive. They were asked, consciously or not, to navigate a delicate balance, to be children in the ordinary sense, while embodying an anomaly that captured attention and imagination. The tension between individuality and collective perception shaped the development of their personalities, sometimes fostering resilience, sometimes contributing to quiet anxiety. Neighbors and outsiders often interpreted the children's appearances through the lens of folklore. Tales of curses, spirits, or divine favor were whispered in homes and at community gatherings. The children, naturally curious and perceptive, picked up on these stories, though they could not yet fully comprehend them. This created an environment in which play, learning, and socialization were constantly influenced by a layer of mystique. Even as they attended school, helped with chores, or played in the fields, they were living symbols of something larger than themselves, something that fascinated, puzzled, and sometimes frightened the adults around them. Despite the weight of public attention, there were moments of tenderness and normalcy that defined their upbringing. Family dinners, evenings by the fire, and quiet walks in the woods provided opportunities to nurture emotional well-being. Parents worked to instill a sense of self beyond physical appearance, emphasizing skills, values, and the bonds of siblinghood. The children learned to laugh, to argue, to comfort one another, and to carve out spaces of ordinary life even under extraordinary circumstances. These moments were fleeting but essential, providing a foundation of stability amid the ceaseless curiosity that marked their daily existence. As they grew older, the tension between normal childhood experiences and public fascination became more pronounced. They became aware, in ways subtle and complex, that their faces elicited reactions different from those of other children. Some learned to embrace the attention, developing resilience and a quiet pride in the mystery they represented. Others recoiled, sensitive to the scrutiny and eager for the moments when they could exist unseen. The valley, once a place of comfort and familiarity, became a stage for the interplay of normalcy and anomaly, a setting in which every glance, every comment, and every encounter could carry significance far beyond the ordinary. Through these experiences, the children's lives were shaped as much by the responses of others as by their own choices. Their days were a delicate negotiation between the innocence of youth and the burdens imposed by appearance, between private identity and public perception. They were ordinary children in their behaviors, desires, and emotions, yet their identical faces rendered them extraordinary in the eyes of the community, and sometimes in their own self-perception. This duality would continue to define their lives, influencing not only their development but the broader story that history would remember, a story of beauty, strangeness, and the complex intersection of human genetics, environment, and culture. As the story of the children with identical faces spread through the valley, it did not remain confined to the narrow lanes of the village or the cautious whispers of neighbors. It took on a life of its own, weaving into the fabric of local folklore and superstition. In a region where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was often porous, the phenomenon became fertile ground for tales of curses, spirits, and divine intervention. People in the surrounding mountains began to speak of the family not merely as subjects of curiosity but as a locus of mysterious forces, a place where ordinary rules seemed suspended and the uncanny reigned. The older generations were the first to give shape to these stories. Grandmothers, who had long recounted tales of spirits in the woods or curses that lingered across generations, framed the children's appearances as part of a moral or cosmic narrative. They told of ancestors who had angered the mountain spirits, of old debts that had to be repaid through misfortune or unusual signs. The identical faces were interpreted as marks, symbols inscribed upon the flesh to remind the living of forces beyond human control. In hushed voices, they spoke of blessings gone awry, divine attention that could be both protective and punitive, and signs that demanded respect, fear, and caution. Children in the village, who were both fascinated and frightened, began to replicate these tales. They whispered to one another about ghost eyes and faces of the mountains, imagining that the identical features were imbued with powers beyond human comprehension. Some claimed to have seen the children in the woods after dark, their expressions solemn, their faces reflecting moonlight in a way that seemed almost spectral. The stories were embroidered with every retelling, gaining details that blurred the line between fact and imagination. In a culture that valued oral storytelling, each iteration added weight to the legend, transforming the family into figures of awe and, in some cases, fear. Local preachers and spiritual leaders sometimes commented on the phenomenon as well. Sermons warned of pride, vanity, or moral transgressions that could manifest in strange ways, using the children's appearances as examples of God's inscrutable designs. These interpretations were never entirely negative. Some framed the likenesses as a form of divine favor, a sign that the family was chosen in some mysterious way. The duality of blessing and curse became a recurring theme, reinforcing the sense that the children were caught between ordinary human existence and the workings of forces that could not be explained. Visitors from outside the valley, whether doctors, journalists, or curious travelers, often failed to grasp the depth of local belief. They recorded measurements, wrote articles, and speculated on genetics, but they rarely captured the cultural and psychological context that surrounded the children. To the villagers, the identical faces were more than a medical anomaly. They were a living story, one that connected the present to ancestral memory, the physical to the spiritual, and the known to the unknown. The valley itself became a character in the narrative, the misty hills and dense forests amplifying the sense that the children's appearances were part of a larger, mysterious design. Rumors spread in ways that were difficult to control. A family member who visited a neighboring town might recount the events, adding details unconsciously or consciously for emphasis. Travelers who passed through the mountains would return with stories of the uncanny likenesses, which were inevitably altered, exaggerated, and sensationalized along the way. Some claimed that the children's eyes could see into the spirit world, that their identical features allowed them to communicate silently, or that their presence could bring misfortune if treated disrespectfully. Each tale added layers to the growing mythology, feeding the mixture of fascination and apprehension that enveloped the family. The psychological impact of this folklore on the children themselves was profound, even if they could not articulate it fully. They grew up aware that their faces were the subject of stories, some benign, others frightening. When passing through the village, people would stare, point, and whisper, and though the children had learned to navigate these reactions, a sense of otherness was ingrained in their consciousness. Play and schooling continued, yet always under the shadow of legend. Even interactions with friends and cousins carried an unspoken awareness that their appearances were extraordinary, and that ordinary rules of social engagement did not always apply. At home, the parents sought to mitigate the impact of these tales. They reinforced the humanity of their children, emphasizing their individual personalities, skills, and worth beyond their identical features. They encouraged play, learning, and creativity, attempting to create a private world in which the children could exist outside the scrutiny of the legend. Yet this effort was never fully successful. The legend had seeped into every corner of their lives, influencing neighbors, visitors, and even the children's own self-perception. The duality of ordinary life and extraordinary myth became a constant presence, shaping experiences in ways both subtle and profound. Some villagers began to integrate the story into a moral framework. They interpreted the children's identical faces as cautionary symbols, a reminder that nature could punish or reward in ways beyond human comprehension. Others used the story as a source of instruction, teaching lessons about respect for elders, for the land, and for the unseen forces that governed existence in these isolated mountains. In this context, the children's features were not merely physical attributes. They were embedded with meaning, a form of living allegory that reinforced cultural norms and beliefs. Over time, the legend became interwoven with local history, merging anecdote with recorded events, memory with speculation. The story of the identical-faced children was told alongside accounts of harsh winters, strange illnesses, and other unexplained occurrences, becoming part of the collective memory of the community. It was preserved in letters, in oral recitations, and eventually in early newspaper mentions, creating a tapestry of narratives that combined observation, imagination, and cultural interpretation. Each telling reinforced the sense that the phenomenon was both real and mysterious, rooted in physical reality yet tinged with the supernatural. As the story traveled beyond the mountains, it was refracted through different lenses. Anthropologists recorded the accounts with interest, attempting to separate fact from folklore. Journalists, seeking sensational stories, emphasized the eerie similarities and hinted at supernatural explanations. Local families clung to their versions of events, insisting on moral or spiritual interpretations that aligned with their worldview. The result was a multiplicity of narratives, each shaped by the perspective and biases of the teller, yet all anchored in the undeniable fact that the children's faces were astonishingly alike. The legend of the identical-faced children became a prism through which the community and outsiders alike interpreted ideas about heredity, identity, and the limits of human understanding. The story was never static. It evolved with each retelling, gaining layers of meaning, embellishment, and interpretation. At its core, however, it remained a story about the collision of the ordinary and the extraordinary, a family living under the gaze of an intense, persistent fascination, where every glance, every whisper, and every observation contributed to a growing mythology that would endure for generations. Through it all, the children continued their lives, navigating the complex interplay of folklore, fear, and curiosity. Their days were marked by routine and labor, by play and learning, yet always colored by the stories that surrounded them. They became both participants in and witnesses to the legend that bore their likenesses, growing up in a world in which identity was shaped as much by perception as by biology. In this valley, shrouded by mist and history, the children's faces were more than mere features. They were symbols, stories, and mysteries, embedded in the landscape of memory and imagination, haunting the minds of all who encountered them. The stillness of the Appalachian Valley, long accustomed to the quiet rhythms of farm life and forested hills, was suddenly punctuated by the arrival of outsiders who carried with them instruments, notebooks, and an unmistakable air of authority. These were not the wandering neighbors or distant cousins who occasionally passed through the village. These were men and women who represented the expanding world of science, journalism, and curiosity beyond the mountains. They arrived on rattling wagons, horseback, or early automobiles that kicked up dust along the narrow dirt tracks, bringing with them an energy that seemed almost foreign to the slow cadence of daily life. Their presence immediately transformed the valley, turning a secluded corner of Appalachia into a stage for observation, speculation, and, in some ways, confrontation. The family, already accustomed to attention from neighbors and local physicians, approached the visitors with a mixture of apprehension and resignation. The children were instructed to sit quietly, to allow themselves to be observed, measured, and photographed, yet the ritual was inherently strange. Cameras clicked and whirred, flashbulbs briefly illuminated the faces that had long fascinated locals, and the professionals scribbled notes with a meticulous intensity that seemed almost ceremonial. The parents, protective yet cooperative, navigated the delicate balance of inviting inquiry while safeguarding their children from intrusion. Every visit brought the sense that their lives were being catalogued, indexed, and, in a sense, claimed by the wider world of science. The scientists themselves were struck by the phenomenon. They had read reports, exchanged letters, and studied photographs sent from the valley, but nothing prepared them for the reality of encountering the children in person. Observers noted immediately the uncanny uniformity of facial features, the precise angles of the jaw, the symmetry of the eyes, the consistency of expressions that seemed to echo across multiple individuals. They measured every aspect they could: head circumference, cheekbone width, nose length, eye spacing, and even subtle asymmetries that could offer clues to the genetic puzzle. Yet despite these meticulous efforts, the phenomenon remained resistant to categorization. The children were living enigmas, impossible to reduce to charts, tables, or diagrams. The arrival of outsiders disrupted the village's social equilibrium. Locals were simultaneously fascinated and wary, watching as their neighbors interacted with these newcomers. Gossip spread quickly, amplified by every new detail, and stories took on an almost theatrical quality. Villagers speculated about the intentions of the scientists, wondering if the children were being studied for benevolent reasons or if the visitors sought to exploit their unusual appearances. Some feared that the investigation could invite ridicule or misfortune, while others welcomed the attention, hoping that it might bring resources, understanding, or even validation for a phenomenon that had long been whispered about. Within the home, the atmosphere was tense. The children were instructed to maintain composure, to respond to questions politely, and to comply with the various examinations. Some adapted with remarkable ease, their young minds absorbing the novelty without fear, while others displayed unease or resistance, sensing the intrusion into their private world. The parents provided reassurance, emphasizing that the visitors were there to understand, not to harm, yet even the most comforting words could not dispel the underlying anxiety. The home, once a sanctuary of routine and normalcy, had been transformed into a space of scrutiny and examination. The scientists approached their work with the tools and theories available to them in 1913. Early anthropological methods emphasized careful observation, precise measurement, and the cataloging of traits to identify patterns. Photographs, though rudimentary by modern standards, were taken from multiple angles, attempting to capture the likenesses with as much fidelity as possible. Measurements were repeated, notes were meticulously kept, and comparisons were drawn between siblings and between other families in the area. Yet the more they measured, the more the anomaly resisted explanation. Every data point seemed to affirm the same troubling conclusion: these were not ordinary children. Their faces, identical in ways that confounded both measurement and expectation, challenged the very framework of heredity as it was understood at the time. The tension between empirical observation and local belief became increasingly apparent. The villagers had their own interpretations, grounded in generations of folklore, superstition, and moral reasoning. They spoke of curses, ancestral debt, and divine attention, while the scientists insisted on rational, observable explanations. These two worldviews clashed in subtle but significant ways. The children, caught between these perspectives, became intermediaries of sorts, embodying both the ordinary innocence of childhood and the extraordinary anomaly that inspired awe, fear, and curiosity in adults. The valley, once a place of private labor and familial routine, now seemed to exist in a liminal space, poised between the known and the unknown, between superstition and science. The interactions were not always harmonious. Some scientists, focused intently on measurement and documentation, failed to recognize the emotional and psychological impact on the children. Their presence, though well-intentioned, could be intimidating, and in moments of resistance or discomfort, the parents intervened to mediate. These episodes highlighted the tension inherent in any investigation of human subjects, particularly when the subjects were children, isolated in a community steeped in both curiosity and fear. The family navigated these interactions with careful diplomacy, accommodating scientific inquiry while protecting the children from undue stress or harm. Observers from outside the mountains often came with preconceived notions, expecting to find either simple hereditary patterns or explanations that would satisfy scientific curiosity without challenging prevailing theories. They were confronted instead with a phenomenon that defied expectation. Each child presented the same facial template, resisting conventional categorization, and compelling the visitors to reconsider the limits of human understanding. Some began to speculate about rare genetic anomalies, others about the influence of environmental factors, yet none could provide a definitive explanation. In this sense, the children became a living challenge to contemporary knowledge, a puzzle that would endure long after the visitors departed. Even as measurements were taken and notes compiled, the cultural and emotional landscape of the valley added layers of complexity to the investigation. Villagers observed, interpreted, and sometimes embellished the events, weaving them into the local narrative. Stories spread of how the children moved, played, and interacted with visitors, reinforcing both awe and apprehension. The family's identity became inseparable from the phenomenon itself. Their lives were increasingly defined by the presence of the outsiders and the scrutiny that accompanied them. Yet despite the intensity of observation and the weight of attention, the children continued to exist as individuals, expressing themselves through play, curiosity, and interaction with each other and their immediate family. By the time the visitors departed, the valley had been irrevocably transformed. The children, now documented in measurements, photographs, and letters sent to distant colleagues, had become a subject of broader interest beyond the mountains. For the family, life returned to its rhythms, yet the presence of the scientific gaze lingered, a reminder that their lives were no longer entirely private. For the villagers, the arrival of outsiders validated their whispers and stories, while simultaneously introducing a new layer of authority and curiosity. The phenomenon had been observed, recorded, and analyzed, yet its essential mystery remained intact, leaving the valley suspended between understanding and wonder, between the ordinary flow of life and the extraordinary anomaly that had briefly brought the wider world to its doorstep. The legacy of these visits extended far beyond the immediate observations. Letters, notebooks, and photographs would circulate, contributing to early 20th century discussions of heredity, anomaly, and human variation. Scholars and physicians would later revisit these records, pondering the interplay of isolation, genetics, and environment that could produce such striking uniformity. Meanwhile, the family returned to daily life, carrying with them the awareness that their children had been examined, measured, and observed in ways that few families would ever experience. Their existence had become a bridge between folklore and science, between the intimate rhythms of mountain life and the wider currents of curiosity, knowledge, and mystery that stretched far beyond the hills. As the years passed and the children grew, a series of unexplained patterns began to emerge that deepened the mystery surrounding the family. Observers noted that beyond the striking uniformity of facial features, there were subtle behaviors and mannerisms shared across the siblings that seemed almost uncanny. The tilt of a head, the way eyes narrowed in thought, even small gestures like the clenching of fists or the way they walked in the yard mirrored one another with a precision that defied simple genetic explanation. Neighbors remarked in hushed tones that it was as if they were watching echoes of a single child multiplied, rather than distinct individuals moving through space. Even more disturbing were the coincidences that appeared to follow the family. Some villagers observed that illnesses seemed to strike the children simultaneously, with fevers, rashes, or minor injuries occurring in parallel across siblings. Others noticed that their moods or emotional states often mirrored one another in ways that seemed synchronistic, creating an impression that they were somehow connected beyond the ordinary bonds of family. These patterns, subtle yet persistent, lent the children an almost spectral presence in the community, reinforcing the sense that their likeness was more than physical, a reflection of something deeper, hidden, and perhaps unknowable. At the edges of the village, whispers suggested that these patterns might be supernatural in origin. Some speculated that the family was touched by unseen forces, that the children's shared features were part of a larger, inscrutable design. Others feared that the synchronization of illness or emotion hinted at a curse that ran through the bloodline. Scholars and scientists, by contrast, struggled to document these coincidences without falling into anecdotal speculation. They recorded timelines of illnesses, behavioral notes, and measurements, Yet even meticulous records could not fully account for the eerie synchronicity that so many observers claimed to witness. These unexplained patterns heightened the tension between observation and mystery, creating an atmosphere in which the ordinary rules of heredity, behavior, and chance seemed to falter. The children were at once living, breathing individuals and enigmatic figures whose presence challenged the assumptions of everyone who encountered them. Their faces, already striking, became symbols of a deeper, unresolved question. How much of human life is governed by genetics, and how much remains beyond comprehension, hidden in patterns that are only partially understood? In the minds of the villagers and visiting scientists alike, the family became an enduring puzzle, a living testament to the limits of knowledge and the persistent power of the unexplained.